thank you so much for inviting me, Lawrence and Fred, and of course, Alicia for doing all the organization. So I don't, unlike many of you, I actually don't know Richard. I didn't know him, never met him. But, as I sat in the audience over the last few days and listened to all of you talk about him and what sort of his, your memories of him and what he's done, it actually occurred to me that Richard and the Leakey family in general has had a huge impact on my life and my career and why I'm standing here today talking to you about Australopithecus afarensis. I actually, funnily enough, first my curiosity for human origin study was sparked when I was 4, when I saw a photo of Mary and Lewis at Olduvai. And that was really my first contact, and it was something that I retained interest in. And then I was gonna go off and be a doctor, I think I'm okay to make this joke right now, but like all good Asian daughters, I was gonna go be a doctor. And then I was in college and I took Introduction to Biology and Anthropology because I thought, well, I just really, I should do something for my social science requirement that I would enjoy. And I want to do something in human evolution, so I did. And that was it. And it's too bad Augustine's not here because he was my professor. He was a newly minted PhD. And what really, really cemented sort of the rest of my questions and the things I want to do was actually going to the Kubifora Field School, where I found my very first fossil, primate proximal radius. Still remember that. And just that sense of excitement, of discovery. And this was a while ago, so this is not the TBI origin school. But the opportunity that I got as a 20-year-old to go off into Kenya and actually find parts of our origin. I think a lot of you in the audience understand that, but that was it. I came back, I told my parents, I'm not going to med school, sorry. And it really was it. I have incredibly supportive parents, obviously. So, and so that, so that really, even though I never met Richard, right, what he has done in establishing these infrastructures really made a difference. It made a huge difference. And I just think about, as I hear all of you talking about TBI and all the infrastructure building, how many more curious 4-year-olds will be inspired and really continue this on. So perhaps that should have been my ending rather than my introduction, because that sounded really inspiring, but. So that has taken me here, thinking about paleoenvironments and Australopithecus afarensis. And I've spent a lot of time actually thinking about this, and a lot of this work is also my colleague and Kay Reed's work on afarensis. We actually have known Kay Reed for a really long time since I was a graduate student, and so we just, a lot of our interests overlap, and so we've been really thinking about this seriously together in terms of sort of what does this mean for afarensis. So Australopithecus afarensis, it's come up. Long-lived species, it sort of covers this wide range in terms of both geography, right, and chronology. It ranges all the way from Tanzania into Ethiopia, and one of the sort of most remarkable things about afarensis is that not just that it's wide-ranging, both in time and space, but that there's quite a lot of it for an early hominin. I have arguments with my sister all the time. She's a doctor. She's like, how can you say all that with a sample size of 1? What is wrong with you? But there's quite a lot of it, right? Hundreds of specimens. And they are from, actually, quite different, they're from different localities too, right? It's not just a lot of specimens from one point in time or space. It's a lot of specimens in different places at different times. So that's why I actually spend so much time thinking about afferences, and have done for quite a long time. And I actually started working on afferences when I was a grad student at Laetoli, and I'll talk a little bit about Laetoli because it's just a really cool, weird place compared to the other afferences sites. And so because you have different sort of afferences localities, right, at different places, during different times, I think that we can start thinking about, well, what were they doing in those places? What are these different populations doing? How did sort of their local habitats affect them? And I think at its core, that's sort of, for me, certainly, that's what I'm really interested in is I leave the species designations to the systematists and taxonomists. I'm really, really interested in what were they doing? And what kind of, how does that affect our understanding of our evolution? Right? And so we can sort of ask two pretty basic questions under this. First is, how do the ecological conditions of different sites sort of compare to each other? I mean, are they the same? Are they different? Intermediate? Overlaps? Like, what's going on, right? And then the second is that, well, what did this mean for these local populations of afferences? If there are differences, how did that impact them? And so we took a look at all the different sites where afferences has been said to be. Some of them have more than others. The sites that's grayed out, Middle Awash, are not included in the analysis I'm going to be talking about because we don't actually have published faunal lists for them. So, but afferences has been reported from there. And you can see from this map, right, how sort of disparate the distribution actually is. And they do cover quite a wide range of time too. Hatter is the youngest, Laetoli is the oldest, and then with Wurranza sort of somewhere in between, and then there's a couple of other older sites as well. And so the way that we did this, we're thinking about a lot of different methodologies, but the ones I want to talk about here today is really looking at these afferences sites within a context of modern mammal communities, right? We're all paleontologists in this room, so for us, our starting point is always what we see around us, right? This helps us understand what the processes and relationships are. Right? That to me is really what we're trying to get at. Right? Understanding these processes that then allow us to make interpretations of our past. And so this is a map of 206, thereabouts, I think, modern mammal communities from all over Africa that Kay Reed and her lab over the last 10 years, 15 years have compiled in terms of their faunal list. And the functional traits that Tara talked about. So thank you, Tara. Actually, that means I don't have to go into a lot of detail. And then what their functional traits were. And so this is just a map showing you all of the different modern communities that are included. And obviously they span, right, quite a large geographic sort of distance. And as Tara also mentioned, that there are certain groups that we just didn't include because well, rodents are usually not because there's just so much, so there's differences in collections, right? In paleontology sites with rodents, they preserve slightly differently, their taphonomic history is different. And so in this case, we actually focused on just herbivores in the sense that non-carnivores, basically, and the ones that are bigger than 500 grams in body size. And we sort of took the functional traits, the ones that have to do with substrate use and diet, and we ran them through this correspondence analysis. And these are all the modern sites. And what you see are sort of these, I should have done the x-axis first. So x-axis first, ignore the y-axis for now. The x-axis where it's really the variation of dimension is really due to rainfall. And so the ones on the far right basically are like rainforest sites, a high annual rainfall, low seasonality. The one on the left are highly seasonal, low rainfall. And on the y-axis, it really seems to be capturing how much water there is on the surface around the year-round. And what that means really is, are there large permanent river systems, lake systems? Because the relationship between rainfall and water availability in terms of what happens in the vegetation is actually really, really important. If you have a lot of rainfall, then it matters a little bit less whether or not you have these big water systems on the landscape in terms of like trees, right? Because they need a lot of water. Whereas if you don't have a lot of rainfall year round, then having that large river system is actually really, really, really important. And we know from looking at modern ecosystems that in these really sort of semi-arid habitats, environments where there's not a lot of rainfall, it's high seasonality, those water systems are really important in terms of organizing the vegetation on the surface. Right? And what's there? How is distributed on the landscape? And so it's really, so this is something that I do want to point out, because a lot of times when we say like some place is very dry, we're sort of like thinking really like dry as in all-encompassing dry. But it may not actually be dry, it may be dry in terms of rainfall, but it may not actually really be dry if there is, and this, from the animal's perspective, I mean, right? If there's actually this large water system there, that then with all the vegetation that comes along with that water system. So basically, surface water ameliorates any sort of impacts of seasonal aridity. So what about the fossils? Where are they? Well, here they are. These are the afferences sites. And it's really interesting when I look at this now, because I remember when I first started using sort of community structure as a way to understand patterns in faunal communities, is that the fossil sites all fall outside of the modern communities. And there, and I wasn't the only person who noticed. I mean, this is in many, many papers where, oh, look, fossil sites are different. So, does this mean that really, like structurally speaking, they're just different? And so what does this mean for us? So there was actually quite a lot of sort of, maybe not necessarily in publication discussions about, but there is a lot of at the bar discussions about that. But interestingly, this is falling, the fossil sites are actually falling, within sort of these modern communities. And partly there is something about, I'm working on it, Kay and I are working on this right now. But I think part of this is because we're only using herbivores. So carnivores aren't included in this. So there is something about sort of our record of carnivores. There's a lot more, if you just look at species lists, right? There's a lot more small carnivores in modern communities than there are in any fossil site. Well, almost any fossil site. And so there's something about them. There's also a body size issue here. And there's a lot more work to be done here that we're thinking through and we're working on in terms of thinking about sort of the taphonomic sort of factors that's involved that really seems to inherently differentiate than the fossil and the modern communities. So let me just sort of point out where the specific fossil sites are. There's Wanzamile, there's Hadar localities, there's Laetoli, all by lonesome, what it was before I included the Jacana Basin sites. Now it's not by its lonesome anymore, it always was. And so what this suggests, right, if we sort of go with this interpretation based on the modern communities is that there is, right, a difference in terms of the, not so much a seasonality, because there's a little spread, but they're not like all over. But in terms of the surface water that's available at each of these sites. And that, it certainly seemed like from this that, okay, you would say Wanzamile overall may have had sort of, whether it's over time or space, had environments associated with a lot more water, and then sort of as you go up, it may be drier. But I think at this point, just sort of thinking about, okay, so these sites have differences in terms of their water systems. And so what that means, right, in terms of the vegetation that comes along with it. And of course, that then means that there's a difference in how the fauna might interact with each other, and that includes the hominins, right? That they are part of that faunal community. And so what did this mean for each of these populations of Afarensis? And so this is our attempt at looking at, I'm amongst friends, so I'm showing this. This is not, this is just trying in terms of thinking about how do we use these sort of modern climatic parameters that's tied to these faunal communities to, can we get at something, right, about sort of the abiotic factors in the past. And there are some really phenomenal, I'm so glad that I was here because there's so much that's being done today. So all of you who talked anything about abiotic factors and deconstructing them, you should probably expect an email from me. So this is based on the fauna. And the rainfall reconstruction, and this is just regressing for the modern communities, the rainfall against the dimension 1. And so if we then, once we have the regression, this is very simple. As I keep on telling Andrew, I am not a mathy person, so I just do the really simple things. And so this is just from a regression. The R-square value is not great, right? So, but it does look like, I mean, when Kevin did his talk, and he had a slide, I think, of the rainfall, this is definitely sort of lower compared to what he has. And so, so maybe let's not take a look necessarily at the numbers. They do feel a little low, and it's just kind of gut feeling, nothing less publishable, alas. Just gut feeling, they're probably a little low. But just maybe looking at sort of patterns, right, rather than the specific number. And so this is just looking at the mean annual precipitation for each of the fossil localities, sort of as in their distance from what the average is for the sites. And these are ordered from sort of oldest to youngest, and the south to north. South to north? And so what you see here is that the older sites all seem like they're wetter, right, compared to the younger sites, that there was more sort of rainfall in the older sites compared to the younger sites. I'm not really sure what to make of that yet. So, but so that's kind of the broad picture, but I like to sort of go a little bit into 3 sites, Wanzamile, Hadar, and Laetoli. Mostly because these are 3 sites that they form kind of the core sites where we have Afarensis specimens from. And 2 are in the Afar region, 1 is in Tanzania. And so, I think a lot of you know that we look at bovids a lot when we think about reconstruction paleoenvironmental conditions. Oof. And so because bovids tend to be relatively habitat specific. They're everywhere in African Paleopleistocene. Every single site has them. They're often the most common ones, not always, but often the most common element of the fauna. And so, it's kind of It's a rough look. And yes, there is definitely this is a very sort of indicator species, sort of we assume that they're doing certain things based on their modern counterparts, right? And certainly isotope studies in the last decade or more have shown us really that that it's not a one-to-one thing. And so I will put that caveat in there. And there's some really, really interesting patterns that I'm excited about. But in this case, just broadly, the kinds of things that they were doing and eating. And so what we find in terms of just the bovid abundances at each of these 3 sites, and you can see that there is a real sort of difference. And this is another, again, this is a correspondence analysis. And there's Laetoli sort of off, on the left by itself. And that it is really closely sort of associated with these bovid taxa that are generally thought of as, sort of being much more open taxa. And then Warnelzemia and Hadar on the right, and Hadar is definitely much more associated with the redundancies. I mean, there's a lot of redundancies from certain levels of Hadar, like a lot. So it's not so surprising that it would be pulled that way. And then Warnelzemia really is looking like there's a much bigger sort of wooded component to it. So this is a kind of summary of what's been published about afferensis habitats for these areas. And what I want to point you to is sort of about the water here. That when you look at this, Warnelzemia, Hadar, Dakika, all have these large permanent sort of river or lake systems at different times. Right? Laetoli does not. I mean, I could do a whole talk on Laetoli, but I opted not to. Probably some of you have heard it probably a gazillion times. At Laetoli, it really is just a local, it's a seasonal river system. There are permanent springs there. There were permanent springs there. There still are permanent springs there. And probably some ponds, right, during a really heavy rainy season. But that's it. And so even though all 4 of them, everyone says mosaics, right? That's like the hated word these days. They're all mosaics. Of course they're mosaics. In some ways, perhaps that shouldn't be so surprising. And I also hate it when people say, oh, that's not surprising. But the fact that you have these really large permanent rivers or lakes at these other afferensis sites and not at Laetoli, to change something about the vegetation. And you can see in those 2 photographs there, it is sort of what kind of difference you could get in terms of vegetation, when there is or is not water. And so I'm just going to put, so this is sort of this is a stylized sort of representation of the major, I guess, components of the habitat at these 3 sites. Hadar and Warnelzemia, large river or lake, none at Laetoli, lots of trees at Warnelzemia, lots of edaphic grasslands at Hadar, and lots of bush and shrub at Laetoli. Right. Now, they all have afferensis, but the difference in terms of the relative abundance of afferensis at those 3 sites is quite striking. At Warnelzemia and Hadar, they're composed of about 2% of large mammal fauna. And definitely there's, we have to think about collection, sort of, different collection strategies and taphonomic biases. And then at Laetoli, it's about 0.2%. So it's quite different. Now, Tara brought up depositional environments, and it's an excellent point, right? Because Laetoli is a completely different depositional environment from Warnelzemia and Hadar. Warnelzemia and Hadar are fluvial lacustrine environments, like a lot of plioplastocene sites. Laetoli is subaerial airfall tuffs. So in many ways, it may be capturing, right? It's basically volcanic ash comes down. If you can't leave, you're dead. And if you're small enough to be totally buried, then you probably have a pretty good chance of being preserved and put into the fossil record. So that's actually, there's like the agent of sort of accumulation, preservation is very different between them. And so I think that that actually does have a lot to do with, what we're saying. But anyways, and so that's kind of just take a look at modern primates for just a moment. This is, this looking at chimpanzee density. And basically, chimps, a great sort of animal really to look at too, compared to us, large-bodied ape, right? And they also range in a lot of different habitats, from rainforest to quite open woodlands. And so what we see is that their density in those different habitats are really, really different too, right? Because obviously rainforest has more of the things that they need and that they eat. And so this is my hypothesis that Woranzimile hatter then represents more optimal habitats for these early hominins compared to Laetoli. That the Laetoli fundamentally, even though they could live there, was probably not the great place for them to be able to thrive and do really, really well. That's more of a marginal environment. And so the next step in thinking about this actually is we've heard a lot about hominin diversity. And I know I said I would leave the diversity issue to the taxonomist and systematists. However, it matters in terms of thinking about how are these large body apes using the landscape together, which shouldn't be such a surprise to us because, lots of closely related species do that. There are sites where gorillas and chimpanzees actually overlap as well. But thinking about that, that's sort of the next thing that we're working on. But when you think about, take a look at this. At Hadar, there's only one species. Woranzimile, certainly at least two, right? Whether or not, we can argue about whether Deiremida is a valid species or not, but certainly Bertellifoot is doing something fundamentally different from Afarensis, right? So why would that be? And this is actually a project that it's a really, really, really big project composed of lots and lots of scientists. I don't remember off the top of my head how many, but really looking at Hadar versus Woranzimile. They're not that far apart. They're only about, 30 miles apart from each other. But actually quite different fauna, certainly different diversity of hominins, right? And so just looking at, I was really excited about Tara's talk because just really thinking about, okay, from the very beginning, ground up, how has tectonics affected all this, right? Which then landscape is affected, obviously, and then hydrological systems, and it comes along with that, the vegetation system, and then the animals, including the hominins. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you again for the invitation.